Back when I was still in college, I used to drive home for the holidays, and since my parents lived all the way across the country, the journey took a day and a half and included an overnight stop in a motel. It was one of those single-story L-shaped places that looked like it had been around since the 50s or something, where the rooms opened directly onto the parking lot. The paint was fading. It had two buzzing neon signs out front that you could hear at night. And since the place was clean and cheap and was mostly exactly a 10-hour drive from college, I figured it was as good a place as any to get some needed sleep. Now, during my sophomore year, I pulled in and paid cash for a room and then parked right in front of my door. I dumped my overnight bag inside, checked the room over to make sure everything was as it should be, and then walked back outside to my car. But as I was locking my door, someone came up to the room next to mine. It was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, and since she was looking down at her phone as she walked past, she slammed into me as she did so. I was about to mumble sorry out of reflex, but she beat me to speaking. Not to offer an apology of her own, but to call me a dumb effing B-word who should watch where she's standing. It was so insane that I was stunned, and I didn't let it bother me. And as I walked to my car, I kind of laughed to myself at how comically terrible some people can be. I also remember being super relieved that I was only staying one night and that I most likely wouldn't have to interact with her again. I had no idea that me and Little Miss Rude were in for a much more significant encounter. I drove down to the same fried chicken place that I stopped by during my freshman year and was relieved to find that it was still open. I got myself a sandwich, some fries, and an iced tea, and then, after back out into the parking lot, I spotted a man standing by what I assumed was his car. It looked like he was watching the people inside through the big panel windows. The second he saw me, he called out in a friendly voice, asking if I could help him. Then when I asked what was going on, he told me his story. So about a week prior, his wife's parents had died in a freak car accident. She was absolutely devastated, but as the days went by, she got worse and worse, until one day, when she seemed to have a complete nervous breakdown and drove off in her car after saying she was going to find her dead parents, like she didn't really believe they were gone. Given what a fragile state of mind his wife was in, the man said he was desperate to find her before she got herself hurt or into trouble. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to show me a picture of her, and when he turned the screen around so I could see, I recognized who it was. It was Little Miss Rude, the lady who barged into me outside my motel room maybe only 45 minutes prior. I took a long look at the picture, staying quiet while I studied it, and then after looking up to meet the man's eyes, I told him, "Nope, sorry, haven't seen her. But if you give me your cell number, I can call you if I do." And I tried to sound as genuine as possible, took down his cell number before wishing him luck, and then walked back to our cars as he thanked me for my kindness. Now, a lot of you are going to ask, why the hell did you just lie to that nice man searching for his wife? And I get it. I'd be asking the same thing if it was me reading this right now. But right as I was on the cusp of telling the guy, "Good news, I know where she is. She's in the hotel room right next to mine," I heard my friend Allie's voice in my head. Allie, who'd been one of my best friends all throughout high school, had suffered through a horrible dating experience back when she was a senior. She ended up dating an older guy, not by much, just a couple of years. But while this guy seemed cool and had a nice car and had money to spend on her, he turned out to be an absolute psycho who could not take no for an answer. She had to quit her job and find one someplace else because he kept showing up trying to either yell at her or beg her to take him back. But just a few months into working at the new place, he showed up there too, and this time, he didn't want to talk. He tried dragging her into his car. The cops were called, it was a whole thing, but then afterwards, when one of her old middle school friends heard about it, she called her in tears saying the whole thing was her fault. The ex-boyfriend had reached out to her, told her a bunch of lies about organizing a surprise party, and then managed to trick her into spilling the beans regarding Allie's new place of work. It was cruel, devious, and manipulative, illustrating exactly why she'd had to break up with him in the first place. So when that guy showed me a picture of his wife, after telling me a bunch of stuff I had no way to verify, I figured that I'd better play it safe. It wasn't just Allie's experience that made me lie to him either. There was something about the way he told his story that just didn't sit right with me. It sounded almost rehearsed, and while I'd obviously help the guy out if his story turned out to be true, it's always better to be safe than sorry. When I got back to the motel, I went straight to the door of the room next to mine and then hesitated a few moments before finally knocking. I saw the curtains twitch to the right of me and then suddenly heard little Miss Rude yell, "What do you want?" She didn't sound mad or crazy, just a little annoyed that I'd knocked on her door, sure, but nothing like the nervous breakdown her husband had described. When I told her I had something to ask her, and it was better to ask face to face, she came to the door and opened it just a crack before peering out at me from the dark inside. She then asked me again in a much lower voice what business I had knocking at her door. Now, I didn't quite know what to say at first, or rather, I didn't quite know how to say it. So instead, I just asked her a question in the form of, "Ma'am, did your parents pass recently?" Now, she just screwed up her face before telling me no. Her father had died many years before, and her mother was still very much alive. It feels tasteless to say this given the circumstances, but that vindication, that confirmation that I was right to withhold information, it felt great. I hadn't been paranoid, and my suspicions had been entirely correct. And the lady still had a confused look on her face, so I quickly told her about the man that I met in the parking lot of that chicken place and how he'd showed me a photograph of her. And the second I said it, her face just dropped and turned white. But not just in shock or realization, she looked more like I'd told her the dead were rising from their graves. She looked terrified, and after a few moments of silence, she told me, "Can you come inside?" And after she shut the door behind us, the first thing she did was thank me, and I witnessed a total shift in this woman's demeanor. She went from rude and antisocial to sweet and vulnerable as she explained that she'd recently escaped from her abusive husband. It wasn't just arguments or bad tempers, but years of steadily escalating violence. Then, by the time she got scared he might beat her to death, she knew it was time to go, and she slipped away while he was at work with nothing but a case of clothes, some cash, and her car. Hearing about all the abuse she went through made my skin crawl, and when I told her I'd lied to him about not seeing her, she looked so relieved that I thought she might cry. I also told her about taking his cell number and joked about how I could misdirect him with a false sighting. Now, this was the first time I actually saw her smile, and she laughed weakly before warning me not to get involved. Then, after thanking me a dozen more times, I went back to my room and got ready for bed. I went to sleep feeling good, like I'd done something truly special in helping a battered spouse avoid her abusive husband. But a couple of hours later, I hear this crash that had me bolting out of bed, terrified. And because in that moment I had major sleepy brain, I initially thought that what I'd heard was a car accident on the highway outside, but I didn't even make it over to the window before I heard another bang. And it was coming from the room next door, the one with little Miss Rude, or as she should really be called, the wife on the run. I dialed 911 on speaker as I threw on some clothes, telling them what was going on before heading out the door into the parking lot. I hadn't seen the husband yet, but I didn't need to. I knew only one man in the world could be responsible for the things she'd screamed, and the only one who would have replied in the way he did. Once I was dressed, I ran out into the parking lot just in time to see the same man from the chicken place parking lot. He had her by the arm, and he was dragging his escaped wife toward a pickup truck. He was dragging her, but she wasn't on her feet. She was unconscious, her legs scraping against the gravel, and the sight of her ragdoll like that made me feel sick. I started yelling and screaming for him to let her go, for people to help her, and before long, a couple of other motel guests came out of their rooms. One of them, a big guy in flannel pajama pants, ran straight toward them and shouted for him to let go. Another man from further down the road joined in. The husband swung at one of them, but in the chaos, a third man came at him from the side and shoved him so hard he let go of his wife. After that, he seemed to realize just how outnumbered he was, and after running to his truck, he peeled out of that lot and zoomed off down the highway. Someone had already called the police and another guest was on the phone with 911 for an ambulance, and the woman just laid on the floor, still out cold with her face all swollen on one side. I started wondering how her husband could have found her, and when it hit me, the realization made me feel twice as nauseous. He must have seen that I recognized her when he showed me that photo of her, or maybe he just smelled the lie for what it was. Then all he had to do was follow me back to the motel at a distance, and then he could have watched from afar as I knocked on that door of her room. I made it easy for him. I thought that I'd been helping her, and instead, I condemned her to face a nightmare come to life. The cops arrived to secure the area, and then not long after, the EMT showed up and wheeled her away on a stretcher. She was awake by then, but she obviously wasn't doing too well, and I couldn't bring myself to try and talk to her because of how guilty I felt. I was convinced that I'd led her abusive husband straight to her, and I'm still convinced that that's the case, even after years upon years of trying to convince myself otherwise. After the cops and EMTs drove off, the whole lot went completely quiet again, and I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. In the morning, I packed my bag and checked out, barely making eye contact with the manager as I did so. I didn't ask about the woman and I couldn't bring myself to. I just sort of got in my car and drove off. I've been cleaning rooms at the Cedar Pines Motel for almost 15 years now. It's not a fancy place, just one of those long, single-story motels you see off the highway, the kind with faded green doors and an ice machine that only seems to work when it wants to. We get a mix of guests. Some are just passing through, some stay for a couple of weeks, and you learn very quickly not to ask too many questions. Now, it was a quiet afternoon in late September, I remember, and I was coming back from cleaning room 8 when I saw a kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, walking back and forth outside room 14. Now, at first, I thought he was just playing, maybe waiting for his parents to come back from the vending machine. But after a while, I noticed that he wasn't playing so much as just sort of pacing up and down. And when I asked him where his mom and dad were, he just sort of shrugged and said he didn't know. I didn't look scared exactly, more like empty. Like whatever had happened had knocked all the pep out of him or something. And after taking the kid's hand, I went to the office to find Carl, the clerk on duty. And Carl's the kind of guy who's been doing this job forever and who doesn't get rattled very easily. I told him about that kid and he checked the logbook. Now, sure enough, room 14 had been rented out the night before to a couple with a child who actually paid cash. Now, the three of us had then tried knocking on the door of room 14. Carl knocked but got no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. He gave me a nervous look, then went to get his master key. And the smell hit me before the door was even halfway open. Not the strong, rotting smell you get when something's been dead a while, more like that metallic tang of fresh blood. The room was a wreck. The bed sheets were tangled and stained, drawers had been pulled out and clothes thrown all over, and one of the lamps were knocked over and cracked. I saw flecks of blood on one of the walls, little spots like someone had flicked a paintbrush dipped in red. There was more on the bed sheets, so much that we couldn't write it off as a nosebleed or something equally harmless. Carl swore under his breath and I stepped back quickly so the kid couldn't see. I put my hands on his shoulders and turned him toward the parking lot, telling him that we were going to wait outside. I tried to keep him talking, asking about school and if he liked cartoons. He barely answered me. It was like he knew what had happened and he couldn't process it yet. The police showed up maybe 20 minutes later. The first 2 deputies went in to search the room. And then not long after, they were joined by another officer in plain clothes who I'm guessing was a detective. And that's when I knew that it must have been something serious, very serious. They kept asking us the same questions over and over, stuff like how we found the kid, what time it was, if we'd seen anyone come or go. And I told them everything we knew, which wasn't much. Carl told them about the cash payment and that there was no car listed on the registry. Now, once I was done with the cops, I kept trying to keep the kid distracted. I found some old crayons in the office desk and a few sheets of paper, and he sat at one of the lobby tables and drew pictures while the cops went in and out of the room. At one point, I remember looking over to see what he was drawing and saw it look like a bed with red scribbles all over it. I don't know if it was my imagination, kind of like filling in the gaps, but I felt horrible knowing that he might have seen something happen to his parents. A few guests came by to see what the commotion was, but the cops kept moving along until one lady, the lady in room 6, said that she thought that she'd heard a loud bang in the middle of the night. It had been loud enough to wake her, but since it only happened the one time, she'd figured it was just someone dropping a heavy suitcase or maybe her hearing something. Only then did she realize that she might well have heard something terrible actually happening. It was maybe 2 hours before a woman from Child Protective Services stopped by to see about the kid. She was polite but firm with us, but super sweet and friendly with the kid as she told him that he needed to go with her to talk to some nice folks over at her office. He didn't ask questions. He just took her hand and followed her to her car. I don't know why, but I knew right then that whatever happened in that room, he wasn't going to see his parents ever again. The police never told us much after that. They took the sheets and the lamp and some clothing and a few other things from the room, and it was sealed for a while, and when I finally got it back to clean, it was completely stripped bare. The mattress was gone, the curtains were gone, almost everything had been taken away to be examined as evidence. They left a faint outline on the carpet where the bed used to be, and even though I scrubbed for hours, I could still see a shadow of that reddish-brown stain on the wall. Every now and then I wonder about that kid, if he remembers that day, if he ever found out what happened. I've cleaned plenty of bad messes in my time, rooms full of garbage, rooms where people overdosed, heck, even rooms where people have died. But there was something different about room 14, something about the quiet way that boy paced outside like he already knew that he was alone. I still work here and not much has changed. The paint on the doors is even more faded and the ice machine still doesn't work half the time, but I can't walk past that room without glancing at the door. I half expect to see a small figure waiting there, pacing back and forth, not knowing, or maybe knowing too well, why Mom and Dad are gone forever. For under 5 years, I used to work the front desk at a little motel in the middle of nowhere. It was a quiet little place, a little run down, but Rhonda, our cleaner, kept the place sparkling. We used to get hunters in the fall, fishermen in the summer, and the occasional trucker rolling in during the midnight hours. And as much as it was mostly a boring job, I came to appreciate the safety and stability. But every so often, we got some real bad men rolling into that old parking lot of ours, and one of them came in the spring of 1996. It was late on a Sunday evening when his car turned into the lot. It had been a quiet day, maybe 4 or 5 check-ins, and I was halfway through a bad cup of coffee when he walked up to the front desk. He looked normal, a regular middle-aged white guy with a big coat and a red woolly hat. He was friendly too and greeted me warmly before saying he wanted a room for the night. I checked which rooms were free, told him the rate, and then after he slid a credit card across the counter, I ran it through, but the machine declined it. And he says, "Huh? That's weird. It's been working fine all day," and then asked me to try the card again. I did not once, but twice, and both times the card was declined. The guy seemed really embarrassed. He pulled out his wallet as he apologized a bunch, and I told him it was fine as he handed me the cash. Those things happen from time to time, and he didn't have anything to apologize for. He gave me this big smile as he thanked me, and then after I handed him his key and directed him to room 6, he thanked me and headed off down the hall. I was working the night shift that night, 9 p.m. to 7 a.m., so aside from watching the place and making sure the vending machine was all stocked up, all I did was watch movies on the little box TV that we kept in the office. I could keep an eye on the parking lot, so if guests rolled in, I could see them coming. But that night, when I saw headlights coming into the lot, I looked up to see not just one, but 2 cruisers from the Mason County Sheriff's Department. 2 deputies stayed outside, watching all the rooms, but one deputy came inside to ask me about a declined credit card a few hours earlier. He knew it had been declined 3 times, and he needed to speak to the person using it. When I mentioned the guy in the red hat, the deputy asked which room he was in, and I led him to the room. The door was locked, but I gave them the spare key. They opened it slowly, and their guns were drawn, but the room was empty. The man in the red hat was gone. One of the deputies said that he must have been watching the parking lot, and when he saw the patrol cars drive by, he slipped out through his room's rear window. He left behind nothing but a half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand, a pair of muddy boots by the bed, and the faint smell of something that I couldn't place right away, almost like hair dye or some type of chemical. The deputies asked me to stay out of the room until another group of cops had searched the place and taken away evidence. But then a few hours later, I was taking out some trash when I overheard 2 of the deputies talking to each other, and what I heard made my skin crawl. They said the forensics guy had found a bag in that room, and that inside were a whole bunch of different wigs. The forensics team said that they'd need to test it to confirm it, but that at first glance, it looked and felt a hell of a lot like real human hair. But it wasn't that which got me. It was hearing one of the deputies say how one of the wigs matched the hair of a missing woman who disappeared only a week or so earlier. And I decided that I didn't want to hear any more. The deputies and forensics folks stayed for a couple of hours. They took the wigs and the boots and even the water bottle. I heard one of them say that they were going to check it for DNA, and when they left, the motel went quiet again, but it felt like anything but peaceful. Just hours before, someone who may or may not have been a psychopath, trophy-seeking murderer had been standing 3 feet from me. I'd handed him a key, smiled at him, and I even told him to have a good night. And all the while, maybe in that bag that he was carrying, there was some missing woman's hair. That thought will stay with me as long as I live, and you should have seen how calm he was too. You'd never have suspected in a million years that he was capable of something like that. No visible nerves, no rush, just sort of still, like he had all the time in the world. And I didn't hear much beyond that. The sheriff came back a few days later to ask me some more questions, but they hadn't caught the guy, and he couldn't say if the hair really did belong to that missing woman, but I could tell by the way he talked that it was probably bad. After that, every time someone walked through that door to check in, I watched them a little differently. I still think about that man, a whole lot actually, because I know people like him don't just exist in movies or the news now. They walk through the front door with a big old smile on their face, pretending there's someone they're not. And you've got no way of knowing who they really are until it's too late.